I was hunched over my workstation in NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory when Cassini began its death dive into Saturn's atmosphere. As chief scientist specializing in astrophysics and alien signals, I'd spent the last 13 years analyzing data from this mission. The screens before me displayed the probe's final transmissions, what should have been routine imagery of ice particles and rocky debris in Saturn's rings. At 4:55 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, everything changed. The incoming data stream suddenly spiked, overwhelming our buffer. Through the static-filled images, we saw it, a massive geometric structure, roughly cylindrical, approximately 3.2 kilometers in length and 800 meters in diameter. It was nestled within the B ring, carefully concealed by sheets of ice particles that seemed to flow around it in unnaturally precise patterns. "Dr. Voss," called Sadie Williams from the adjacent terminal, "are you seeing this?" Her voice trembled as she enhanced the resolution, revealing the structure's surface. It was covered in regular hexagonal patterns that could only be artificial in origin. The material appeared to be some kind of black metal or composite that absorbed nearly all incoming light, creating a void-like silhouette against the bright ice particles. Before we could process more detail, Cassini plunged into Saturn's atmosphere. Its final transmission captured what looked like massive doors or airlocks along the structure's hull, their perfect geometric precision a mockery of natural formation. 3 months later, I stood in a classified briefing room at Johnson Space Center, surrounded by the crew that would join me aboard the USS Sagan. Captain Marcus Hale paced at the front of the room, his weathered face illuminated by projections of Cassini's final images. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of command despite its quiet tone, "what you're about to undertake is beyond classified. The existence of this mission, this room, this conversation, none of it happened." He paused before the main screen, his reflection overlaying the alien structure. 3 years ago, I lost my entire crew on the Europa deep space mission. I swore I'd never command again. But this, he gestured to the images, this changes everything. I studied my fellow crew members as Hale spoke. Commander Elias Kane sat ramrod straight, his military bearing almost too perfect, fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the conference table. Lieutenant Alex Kessler, our communications officer, was already taking notes, his eyes bright with barely contained excitement. Engineer Jonah Maddox, barely out of MIT, kept glancing at the door as if expecting someone to burst in and tell him this was all a mistake. The mission parameters were clear. Approach the structure under complete communications blackout, investigate its purpose, and retrieve any technological artifacts that could advance human understanding. The USS Sagan, a prototype deep space vessel equipped with experimental quantum drives, would take us there in just under 3 months. The first signs of trouble started 300,000 kilometers from Saturn. I was analyzing radiation data when Lieutenant Kessler called me to the communications bay. "Listen to this," he said, adjusting his headset. Through the speakers came a rhythmic pulse, like a massive heartbeat slowed down 1,000 times. The frequency matched exactly with readings from Cassini's final transmission. "The signal's getting stronger," Kessler reported, his usual humor replaced by focused intensity. "But there's something else." He isolated another channel, and I felt my skin crawl. Beneath the mechanical pulse were sounds that shouldn't exist in space, whispers that seemed to form words in languages that hurt to hear. Commander Kane's reaction was subtle but noticeable. His left eye twitched as the sounds played, and his typical rigid posture seemed more like barely controlled tension. "Shut it off," he ordered, then immediately composed himself. "Log it and continue monitoring." The ship's systems began behaving erratically. Lights flickered in sequences that almost seemed intentional. The quantum drive's output fluctuated in patterns that exactly matched the alien pulse. Engineer Maddox spent hours trying to isolate the cause, but every diagnostic came back normal. The USS Sagan's maneuvering thrusters fired in controlled bursts as we approached the B ring. Through the observation deck's reinforced windows, Saturn filled half the sky, a massive gold-brown eye staring back at us. The rings stretched out like a vast plain of diamond dust, individual ice particles visible as crystalline stars. "Beginning insertion sequence," Maddox announced from engineering, his voice tight with concentration. "Ring particles at expected density, implementing debris deflection shields." We threaded our way through the ice field using a complex series of gravitational calculations. Each particle in Saturn's rings moved in its own perfect orbit, but as we got closer to the structure's coordinates, we noticed something odd. The ice wasn't behaving according to normal orbital mechanics. Instead, it flowed in deliberate patterns, like iron filings around a magnet. "Energy readings are off the scale," I reported, checking my instruments. "The structure is emanating some kind of low-frequency vibration. It's affecting the ring particles themselves." That's when we saw it. The black monolith emerged from the ice field like a leviathan surfacing from a frozen sea. Up close, its surface wasn't simply black. It seemed to bend light around itself, creating visual distortions that made it difficult to focus on any one section. The geometric patterns we'd seen in Cassini's images were actually deep channels carved into its hull, each pulsing with a faint blue luminescence that matched the frequency we'd been detecting. "Look at this," Kane said, pointing to his tactical display. "The ring particles, they're moving in sync with those pulses. The whole structure is generating some kind of orbital stabilization field." Engineer Maddox's voice came over the comm, higher than usual with barely controlled panic. "Captain, I'm detecting power signatures unlike anything in our database. Whatever this thing is, it's not dormant, it's active." We approached a section of the hull that appeared to be an airlock, a hexagonal recession about 30 meters across. Before we could begin docking procedures, the surface changed. There's no other way to describe it. The solid metal simply flowed aside like liquid, creating a perfect seal around our docking collar. "That's impossible," Maddox whispered. "The material temperature readings, it's not melting, it's reorganizing itself at the molecular level." Captain Hale's voice remained steady, though I noticed his hands gripping the command chair's armrests tighter than necessary. "Full environmental suits. Nobody takes them off under any circumstances. Dr. Voss, you're with me. Commander Kane, coordinate from the bridge. Maddox, Kessler, you're our backup." The airlock cycle was unlike anything in human engineering. Instead of pumping air in or out, the chamber seemed to phase shift around us, transitioning us from our atmosphere to the structure's interior without any noticeable pressure change. The inner doors opened the same way as the outer, flowing apart like mercury. We stepped into a corridor that defied Euclidean geometry. The walls curved in ways that suggested we were walking both uphill and downhill simultaneously. Every surface was covered in the same geometric patterns we'd seen outside, but from within, they were clearly more than decorative. Rivers of blue-white energy pulsed through the channels, flowing in complex sequences that reminded me of circuit boards. "The air's breathable," Maddox reported, checking his instruments. "Atmospheric composition is nearly identical to Earth's, but there's something else. Trace particles of an unknown element." "Keep your helmet sealed," Hale ordered, "and watch your step. The gravity's inconsistent." He was right. Each step felt slightly different, as if the structure was adjusting its gravitational field in real time. Our boots connected with the floor with varying degrees of force, making walking a disorienting experience. The walls themselves seemed to be alive with machinery. Massive pistons the size of subway cars moved with glacial slowness, their purpose unclear, but their movements precisely coordinated. Conduits of what appeared to be liquid light pulsed in rhythms that matched the vibrations we'd detected earlier. "Captain," I called out, examining a section of wall covered in particularly dense groupings of symbols. "These glyphs, they're not random. There's a pattern. They're repeating in sequences of 7, but each repetition is slightly different. It's like they're describing a process." "Can you read them?" Kane's voice crackled over the comm. "Not exactly, but..." I traced the patterns with my gloved hand. "There are mathematical constants encoded in these sequences. Pi, phi, Euler's number. This isn't just writing. It's a technical manual of some kind." That's when we first heard it. Not through our comms, but directly in our minds. A sound like vast gears grinding against each other, forming patterns that almost resembled words. Commander Kane's breathing became ragged over the radio. "The whispers," he muttered. "They're the same. The same as in my dreams. They've been calling us here. All along, they've been calling us." The further we ventured into the structure, the more its true nature began to reveal itself. We entered a vast chamber that seemed to function as some kind of control center. Massive holographic displays filled the air with incomprehensible symbols, while twisted columns of that same black material rose from floor to ceiling, each one alive with pulsing energy conduits. "This is incredible," I breathed, approaching one of the displays. The symbols shifted and changed as I moved, responding to my presence. "These are real-time calculations. Look at these values. They're measuring gravitational forces, orbital velocities." I pointed to a particular sequence. This one shows the mass distribution across Saturn's entire ring system. Maddox had made his way to what appeared to be a central control interface, a hexagonal pedestal whose surface rippled like black water. "Dr. Voss, these readings suggest the whole structure is part of a massive machine. It's generating some kind of artificial gravitational field that keeps Saturn's rings stable." "Don't touch anything," Captain Hale warned, but Maddox was already reaching toward the interface, engineer's curiosity overwhelming caution. "I think I can access its primary systems. These controls are almost intuitive, like they're designed to respond to conscious intent rather than physical input." His fingers made contact with the liquid-like surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire chamber erupted in pulsing red light. The holographic displays flickered and changed, showing what looked like warning symbols. "What did you do?" Hale demanded. But before Maddox could respond, we felt the structure shudder. Through the transparent sections of the walls, we could see Saturn's rings beginning to shift. Massive chunks of ice and rock, some the size of mountains, began to break free from their stable orbits. "The stabilization field!" I shouted, frantically trying to decode the warnings floating in the air around us. "It's failing. The whole system is going into some kind of emergency shutdown." That's when we heard it, a sound like metal being torn apart, but at a frequency that made our teeth vibrate. From recesses in the walls that hadn't been there moments before, they emerged. The silent engineers were nothing like any life form we'd imagined encountering. Each one was at least 15 feet long, their bodies segmented like massive centipedes, but composed of the same light-absorbing material as the structure itself. Where heads should have been, they had clusters of crystalline organs that pulsed with internal light, each pulse corresponding to the whispers we'd been hearing in our minds. Their movements were impossibly smooth, as if they existed partially out of phase with normal space-time. As they emerged, the very geometry of the chamber seemed to twist around them, creating impossible angles and corridors that hadn't existed before. Commander Kane's composure finally shattered. "No," he whispered, backing away. "No, I've seen you. Every night in my dreams, I've seen you. You've been waiting. You've been calling." His hand moved to his sidearm. "Commander, stand down!" Hale barked, but it was too late. Kane fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The first 2 passed through the nearest engineer as if it was made of smoke, but the third struck one of its crystalline organs. Instead of shattering, the crystal began to leak what looked like liquid darkness, actual tangible shadow that began to spread through the air like ink through water. The response was immediate and horrifying. Every engineer in the chamber turned toward us and emitted a harmonized scream that existed simultaneously at frequencies both too high and too low for human ears to process. Yet somehow we heard it, felt it in our bones, in our minds. It carried with it images, visions of Saturn's rings collapsing, of gravitational chaos spreading through the solar system, of Earth's orbit destabilizing as the careful balance of the solar system unraveled. "Back to the ship," Hale ordered as the structure around us began to convulse. "Move!" But retreat wasn't that simple. The corridors had changed, rearranging themselves into new configurations. We ran through passages that seemed to loop back on themselves, guided only by Maddox's increasingly desperate attempts to track our position relative to the docking port. Commander Kane ran ahead of us, his breathing becoming more erratic with each step. "They're in my head," he gasped. "They're showing me what they built this for, what they're protecting us from." He rounded a corner and his voice cut off in a sudden scream. By the time we reached the intersection, he was gone. Only his helmet remained, lying on the floor as if it had been phased right off his head. As we stood there staring at Kane's empty helmet, I finally managed to piece together the meaning behind the glyphs I'd been studying. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. "Captain," I gasped, pointing to a sequence of symbols pulsing along the corridor walls. "I understand now. This facility, it's not just studying Saturn's rings. It's maintaining them. The rings aren't natural formations at all." "What are you talking about?" Maddox demanded, his young face pale behind his helmet visor. "Look at these equations," I said, gesturing to the flowing symbols. "They describe a gravitational stabilization system on a solar system scale. Saturn's rings act as a kind of gravitational anchor point. They help maintain the delicate orbital mechanics of the entire solar system. Without them..." A violent shudder ran through the structure, punctuating my words. Through the transparent sections of the hull, we could see massive chunks of ice and rock beginning to rain down towards Saturn's atmosphere. Each impact sent ripples through space-time itself, ripples we could actually see distorting the light from distant stars. "The engineers," I continued, "they've been maintaining this system for millions of years, maybe billions. That's why they went into hibernation. They only wake when the system needs adjustment or repair." "And we just broke it," Maddox whispered. Captain Hale's voice cut through our horror with military precision. "How do we fix it?" I studied the symbols racing across the walls. "The control interface Maddox activated. It needs to be reset, but the sequence is incredibly complex. It would take hours to decode, and we don't have that kind of time. Once the ring's degradation passes a certain point, the gravitational cascade will be irreversible." Another impact shook the structure. Through our suit radios, we could hear Kessler on the Sagan. "Captain, we're detecting gravitational anomalies spreading through the solar system. They're small now, but they're growing exponentially. At this rate, Earth's orbit will begin to destabilize within hours." The silent engineers had begun to gather around us, their crystalline head clusters pulsing with increasingly urgent patterns. The whispers in our minds took on a new character. Not just sounds now, but images, concepts. They were trying to communicate. "They're showing me," I said, pressing my hands to my helmet. "The interface, it doesn't need to be decoded. It needs consciousness, a mind to interface with their system. But the process, it's not meant for human minds. The integration would be fatal," Hale finished. His voice was calm, almost peaceful. "How long would it take?" "Captain, no," Maddox protested, but Hale ignored him. "The engineers are showing me too," he said. "Kane saw it before they took him. This facility is all that stands between our solar system and chaos. Someone has to stay. Someone has to maintain the system." "It'll kill you," I said. "The human brain isn't designed to process this kind of information. The interface will burn out your neural pathways even as it uses them to restore the system." Hale removed his helmet. Despite our protests, despite everything we'd seen, he smiled. "Better than losing Earth. Better than losing everything." He turned to us. "Get back to the ship. That's an order." "Captain," Maddox began, but Hale cut him off. "I lost my entire crew once before," he said. "I won't lose another. Go. Tell them what's out here. Tell them to leave it alone." The engineers parted as Hale walked toward the control interface. Their crystalline clusters pulsed in what almost seemed like approval. As we backed away, I saw him place his hands on the liquid black surface. His body went rigid, and patterns of light began to race across his skin like circuit traces. "Run!" he gasped, his voice already changing. becoming something more than human. Run! We ran. Through corridors that now seemed to guide us rather than confuse us, past machinery that pulsed with renewed purpose. Behind us, we could hear Hale's voice merged with the engineer's whispers, speaking in tongues no human was meant to understand. We reached the Sagan just as another gravitational wave hit. Through the viewports, we watched in awe as Saturn's rings began to stabilize. Pieces of ice and rock that had broken free flowed back into perfect orbital patterns, guided by forces we could barely comprehend. The structure itself seemed to pulse with new energy. And there, in one of its transparent sections, we saw a figure that might have once been Marcus Hale. His body had become partially translucent, threaded through with the same light that filled the engineer's crystalline clusters. He raised a hand in what might have been farewell or warning. His last transmission came through our radios, barely recognizable as human speech. Keep the system stable, or we all die. The official records show that the USS Sagan's mission was scrubbed due to technical difficulties. Commander Kane is listed as missing in action, presumed dead. Captain Hale's sacrifice is recorded as a deep space accident, details classified. But on clear nights, when Saturn is visible, I sometimes set up my telescope and watch its rings. They pulse occasionally with that same blue light we saw in the structure, and sometimes, in the static between radio frequencies, I catch fragments of familiar whispers, and among them, what might be a human voice, still keeping watch, still maintaining the delicate balance that keeps our world turning. The silent engineers continue their vigil, hidden in plain sight within Saturn's rings. And with them, transformed into something beyond human comprehension, Marcus Hale maintains his final post. A guardian protecting not just Earth, but the entire solar system from a chaos we nearly unleashed. We never returned to Saturn's rings. NASA buried the evidence, classified everything. But those of us who survived, we know the truth. We know that humanity's first contact with alien life didn't come with a message of peace or war, but with a simple warning: some systems are best left undisturbed. Some nights I dream about what Kane saw in those final moments before the engineers took him, about what Hale might be experiencing now, his consciousness merged with ancient alien machinery. But mostly, I pray that humanity heeds the warning. Because if we disturb the silent engineers again, there might not be another Marcus Hale to save us,